all sorts of things, and we all have it. Every culture, every language has their own slang, has their own idioms, have their own sort of say unique ways of expressing themselves that are not always known to others. Dialects, accents, things like that. And that makes it unique, obviously. But this next section really focuses on languages and the way different groups, nationalities, or language groups essentially use language, okay? So English, we've talked a lot about English in this class, so I don't feel like I need to devote a lot of attention to it, but let's just say that Americans use English freely. English, especially in American culture, people are encouraged to talk, encouraged to say what they wish, whenever they wish, and however they wish, okay? That they have a lot of freedom, and they feel free to talk all the time about anything. Nothing is held back, let's put it that way. All right, no problem. Okay, sounds good. So that's the idea. Now, Americans, because Americans are individualists, tend to use a lot of first-person pronouns, like I, in their own speaking and writing, which is normal, because that's how people see their identity. They're individualists. And as far as, English differs, there are different types of English out there, by the way. And those types will adapt from culture to culture, place to place. Like Caribbean English, for example, is one variety of English. If you ever travel to the Caribbean, to a country that is English speaking, you will find out that the way they speak English in that Caribbean country is a bit different than the way they speak English in America, or Great Britain for that matter. So, British people always laugh at Americans and they say that you don't speak English, you speak American. So they're very particular about that. And so I actually learned British English when I was young. And that's my first foreign language, let's put it that way. So British people, by the way, put a much greater emphasis on the social status. And British people are much more formal in their speech. So the way, British people speak English is different from the way Americans. Americans are much more casual. And in Britain, people are much more formal. So, and even if they come to America, they feel like speaking in a much more formal way because that's how they do. That's culturally normal to them. Spanish language has some very unique features. Of course, from perspective of somebody who does not speak Spanish, like an American, for example, and this textbook is written for Americans, by the way, the idea of genders, okay, in language, like the ellos and the ellas, niñas and niños, that's foreign. That's really foreign to an English speaker. The concept that you can have a gender attached to a particular word and express every word with the gender and then put a diminutive accent like niño, niñas. These are diminutive, accents, that the diminutive particles that make it sound like this is something little, something small, That's a peculiar feature of, Spanish language that non-Spanish speakers simply do not understand. And while, there's certain sort of say culture of, formality and informality and, among Spanish speakers, is what people note in this textbook, the writers of this next book note, is that even among Spanish speakers, there's differences of how people use it directly or indirectly. So some people are more direct with their speech. Some people are less direct. Some are more formal, some are less formal. So in Spain, it's more formal. In Mexico, it's less formal. But there's some people are more direct, people are indirect. Mexicans, for example, Mexican version of Spanish is known for indirect, kind of not saying exactly what you mean or saying it in a roundabout way. And the reason is because to Mexicans, the relationship is very important, and you want to not cause tension in a relationship, and so you allow yourself to use the kind of language that would smooth things out. Let's put it that way. Interesting thing that the author says that Mexican usually attempts to make every interaction harmonious, and in doing so appear to agree with every other person's opinion. I don't know if you ran into this before, but yes, that is a feature of an indirect communication. It sounds like people are saying yes to everything you're saying. And if you're an American, it's very annoying because it sounds like person is being disingenuous. They can't possibly agree with everything you're saying. It's not possible for you to say yes to everything I say. If you don't see with me eye to eye, it's normal, but the fact that you do, or at least you say you do, that makes me think that you're not honest. So actually, Mexicans catch a lot of flack for being dishonest. And they're not being dishonest, they're being nice, okay? But they sound dishonest to another person. So Americans see that politeness, that agreeability, they see that as dishonesty. They see that as a person not being, open about what they really think, or how they really feel. So I also like, there's a feature of speech among Mexicans that people do not tend. They didn't mention in this textbook, but some of the other textbooks that I've had before mentioned this, is that the tendency to make things grand or make things small. Okay, so it's very normal for in Mexican Spanish for people to exaggerate. Everything is grande. Everything is huge, or everything is tiny. It's just the idea of exaggeration is very common to specifically, Mexican culture and the way they use Spanish. So a person can say, "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," or something like that. And the truth is, no, you're not the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I did see a more beautiful woman just yesterday, or, right there on the cover of the Vanity Fair magazine. But to you, right now, between me and you, at this moment of relationship, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in this room. Something like that. And they're being honest, right? They're not trying to be dishonest, but they are exaggerating at the same time. Because when you push it, it's really not 100% true. But to them, it is true. So in their reality at that moment, it's true. So that's how they feel. Therefore, it makes it true. And some people will be considered dishonest for being this way, but other culture will consider dishonest, but within their own culture, everyone will understand that type of an exaggeration in context. So there's a little section here in Brazilian Portuguese, and they talk about the formality and the long names. And so I have noticed that Brazilians do have long names. And that has to do, I know it has to do with culture, I know it has to do with language. There's a lot of heritage behind that, and it's very important. Although other people, fail to appreciate that. So maybe you guys can tell me what the big deal about long names. Is that have to do with status? Does it have to do with family? Why is that so important? Anybody?
Because we have a lot of surnames and last names. Mm-hmm. Because it's usually in Brazil, use a last name or a family name from your mother and last name from your father, and sometimes you put another name from a good guy when you have a great admiration about.
Okay.
Like a hero for you, or a good guy in your family. You make you honor this guy, honor this person, and put this name is 1, 2, 3, and last name 1, last name 2, and last name 3.
So it's a way to show respect, essentially.
Yeah.
It is a way. So having long names is a way of showing respect. That makes sense. It's paying homage to your family, remembering who they are, but also showing respect or even admiration for somebody who's not even part of your family per se. Right?
Yeah, I have a case when I came here, and we went to a Department of Health for kids,
Yes.
a county.
Sure.
And my first kid, my son, the last name is totally different.
Right.
First is my last name,
Right.
and the last name is my wife's last name.
Right.
And my daughter is opposite.
The opposite.
Yeah. And for Americans, he's not your son.
They
He's
don't
not your
understand.
son. Yeah, he is my son.
Would you like to do a DNA test, right?
In school is have a lot of problem because they don't but his last name is this and her last name is other.
Yeah. You just tell them we make up names the way we want to, it's it, and they will explain it to them. It is a very difficult cultural, sort of say idea to embrace.
Yeah, I spent a lot of minutes to explain this for the nurses in.
I'm sure you do. So how about this? How about this, Matthias? When you have to fill out a form, all your names don't fit onto the form, right?
Yeah, my wife told me, well, every time you use a different last name, don't I can't put my last name in this form.
Yeah. So here's my suggestion for you, and this is actually absolutely normal in the United States. A lot of people in the United States actually use nicknames. Okay, so if you want to make your life simpler without having to explain the same thing over and over everywhere you go, your name is your name. It's never going to change. It's who you are. But for the purpose of public use a nickname or use a shortened version, and that will be absolutely accepted pretty much everywhere. But you can have a particular public name, and then you can have your formal real name that's based on your documents, your passport, and everywhere else. And most people do not have a problem with that. So they know that's quite a common practice in the United States because people do come from all over the world. Some of the names are hard to pronounce, so they take on nicknames or shorten their names, and that has been a part of American history for a long time. So, although it goes against your culture, right, to do that, because the very reason you have a long name, is something completely different. But for American public, unfortunately, you're gonna have to deal with that so many times. So
yeah, I will use this nickname I think is better for me and just for forms too. Fill
forms for practical purposes. You could say, well, this is the name I go by, and if you say that to people, they will understand. This is the name I go by. But if you want my formal legal name, this is it, the whole thing, But this is the name I go by. I've met people of all sorts that have very long, complicated names, and they say, I just go by Mike, because it makes it easy.
Put John Adams. This is good.
That's it. There you go. There you go. It's so thank you guys for showing me. But so the authors do not go into deep sort of say discussion on how Brazilians use language, except of talking about respect, senor, senora, things like that, and titles and long names and things like that. That's important. But I think every language, the whole point is in this whole chapter is that every language group out there, they have a very peculiar uses of how they express feelings about things, formality and informality, and things like that. So the next group here is the Northeast Asian languages, which they actually kind of group everyone together because there's similarity. Even though the languages are quite different, the way people use language is similar. Okay. The concern for the person's face, right? We talked about the concept of face. What is face? Face is the persona that you put forward publicly, right? So there's this concept of face, which is in Asian cultures is very, very strong. Okay. very prevalent, much more so than in other cultures. Why do Japanese people look the way they look? They like to look dispassionate. A lot of times Americans in particular are very much fazed by having to do business with somebody from Japan, and they can't tell if the person likes what they say or doesn't like what they say, because the person shows no emotion. And that is something that people do, culturally speaking, because they are preserving that demeanor, of being controlled and not expressing their feelings. And that's so natural to them that when Americans try to get a certain feeling out of a person and they get nothing, they can't tell. They need to gauge whether they're, where they are with that person, and they can't. So there is a formality in Northeast Asian languages. There's a lot of, hierarchy. The idea of promoting status is very important. So formality and hierarchy are reflected in language by titles, for example. Japanese use proper titles for everyone. This is basically, culturally shows a really deep way of, we're going to differentiate who is who by addressing different people in a different way. The way children are addressed, the way adults are addressed, the way superiors are addressed, the way elders are addressed, the way people who have reached certain status socially are addressed is different. With every category, there's a different address. Now, that may sound completely strange and weird to you, but that is just how it is in a society that's very hierarchical, that recognizes the importance of status more so than other people. So there's a few elements over here on Chinese and Korean and Japanese that the authors talk about. And while there are overarching ideas, there are also some different ideas. Authority figures, for example, the way they're addressed in Chinese are very distinct ways. Let's see, people speak in a very respectful way. There's a lot of respect that goes on, mainly because the idea of promoting harmony and avoiding conflict is very big part of all Asian cultures and Chinese culture as well. So the addressing of parents, I thought that was very interesting to me. In Korean, the example they give, this is our mother or our father, rather than person, my mother or my father. Is that true? Is that how it works?
Yeah, we're always using our.
Always our. See, that reflects that's I thank you for confirming that to me, because sometimes I read these guys and I'm like, are they right or are they wrong? I don't know. I have to check. But since I have you guys in my class, I get to check. So this is cool. So our mother, this is our mother, this is our father. This sounds really great, because it expresses culturally the value of that collective identity that other cultures would not. Americans, they would say, this is my, mother, and that's very individualistic, So this is a great example of how differently people use language, and how their culture is reflected as well. So let's see. So Japanese, a lot of the same ideas, a lot of the same overlap. Status, social position are reflected in the way people are addressed. In business context, juniors will employ polite speech when addressing their seniors, who may reply in the informal speech. Okay, so if you're a person of a high status, nobody is allowed to address you except in some proper and very honorable way. But you can address other people of a lower status whichever way you wish, and sometimes actually address them in a less respectful way, because you need to differentiate, and that's perfectly acceptable. Now, to Americans, this is absolutely insane. Americans would not understand this type of behavior, where one person it has to be spoken to this way, but they can speak to everyone else in a different way because everyone else is lower status than they are, or something like that. So Anyway, that makes no sense to them. But it is in a cultures where hierarchy and status are very important. It makes total sense. Okay, Arabic. Arabic is an interesting situation, and when I say Arabic, a lot of times you have to understand this is not just Arabs like who live in Arabian Peninsula or people who speak Arabic. This is typical of actually most Middle Easterners. Most Middle Easterners would feel would use. Okay, so Arabic does have a lot of respect because it's considered to be a holy language. Of course, it's the language of Quran, but it's a very emotional language. It's not that different from Hebrew, by the way. Hebrew feels the same way. So whether you're speaking Hebrew or Arabic, any Middle Eastern language is very emotional. The authors quote phrase here, "A man's tongue is his sword." And that's normal for, an Arab culture to realize that your tongue is your sword. Well, have you read the book of James lately? It communicates the same message. In the very opening of the book of James, it talks about how you use your mouth. With these lips, you praise God, and with the same lips, and it talks about controlling your tongue or taming your tongue, as if your tongue was a wild animal. So instead of calling your tongue a sword, the book of James, for example, which of course comes from a Hebrew culture, rather than Greek culture, remember, these are first century Jews writing it. And they talk about their tongue being uncontrolled like a wild animal. And you need to control it, you need to tame it, you need to muzzle it, because your tongue can hurt people, essentially. This is the same idea as tongue being your sword. You got to be careful with it. And because Semitic languages, Middle Eastern languages, are very emotion-packed. So something that the authors say that's very, very true, I can confirm this to you for sure, being able to speak Semitic languages, is on page 282, they say that Arabs approach their language as a social conduit, which emotional resonance is stressed, which consists of the Western view that language means transfer information. So in the West, language is a way to transfer information. Think of it this way. The way that an average American or a British person or even a European would use language is to tell you something, transfer information, right? That's what we're doing with language. Now, in the Semitic language, it's not about information. It's transferring emotion. It's transferring feeling. Information is secondary. Emotion is primary. How I feel is more important than the contents, of what I'm saying. So they're meant to express feeling first and foremost. And this is probably the biggest difference between European languages and Semitic languages. And this is why people don't understand that. A lot of times people struggle understanding the Bible because they focus on the content, while the Bible is actually trying to communicate emotion more than anything, because it is written in that same Semitic tradition. So the words are often used for their own sake rather than for what they understood to mean. So assertion, repetition, exaggeration are used with regularity. That's absolutely true. And by the way, if you're studying your Bible, this is very important. Assertion, repetition, and exaggeration are very common. Think of how many times Jesus says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off, right? Something like that. He doesn't really mean cut off your hand. He's exaggerating. And there's a lot of exaggeration. You'll read it in the Gospels. Why? Because again, they're a product of Semitic literature, but you would also see this in the way that Arabs speak today. They will exaggerate. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of waving of your hands when people talk. In the Middle East, you will notice that when people talk, they talk loud and they wave their hands. I don't know if you observed that or not. I've observed that a lot. But just because they talk loud and wave their hands, that doesn't mean they're fighting. It doesn't mean they're angry either. To an outsider, it may sound like they are angry or they're fighting. Their mode of speaking is filled with emotion and expression, and it is allowed to kind of let it out. But it doesn't mean that they're angry or fighting. This is just normal, animated way. The reason that people are animated, the reason why they wave their hands and sometimes raise their voice, is because they really care. Let's put it that way. They're passionate about it. They're interested. They're into it. They're fully engaged. Let's put it that way. That's what it really expresses. So a lot of times people would see people waving their hands and talking, and they think they're about to have a fight. Well, nothing of the sort. It's just a very emotional way of expressing ideas, and everyone within the culture understands that that's it. That's okay. That's normal. But outsiders are always taken back by it, thinking that it's some sort of aggressive way of doing that. But again, that is not always uniform. If you're speaking to a person who is an elder, you tone things down. You always, like with person to person, friends, peers, they can get really emotional and wave their hands and almost raise their voices to the point of discomfort to each other. But when you speak to an elder, you never raise your voice. You actually tone things down just to show respect, and being a patriarchal, type of a culture in the Middle East, that's the normal thing to do, is to show that type of respect. Okay, Germans. Germans are known that for being very precise, and the Germans are, very proud of their language. Obviously, Germans have a lot that they've given to the world in various fields. But one of the things about Germans that everyone notices is that Germans are formal in the way they speak. Germans are conscious of the status. They always address people with proper names. Most of the time, put your last name first. Last names are very important to Germans. There is a feature in German language of you as familiar you and you as respectful or formal you. Okay, just as it is in some other languages as well. But again, it just shows the level of formality. In English, when I say you, I can mean you plural or you singular, right? And there's no way for me to express that. But in German, you have sie and du, in French, there's tu and vous. And another language is the same thing, of like you respectful and you familiar. The way you say you to your grandparent is different than the way you say you to your child. Just different you, right? It still means the same. You're addressing that person by using a second person pronoun, but it's a respectful way of addressing versus a common or informal way of addressing person. So Germans definitely have that differentiation, and Germans, the textbook says Germans provide much more information that most cultures require. The Germans are very detailed, and so people do joke even about Germans being way too detailed. People say don't ever ask a German to write a manual for something, because it will be 300 pages long. And it will be a simple thing. How to open a water bottle. And they'll be very specific. They'll go into every detail on how to do it. And then they will also highlight every possible scenario in which that water bottle will need to be opened. So way too detailed for some people. But Germans obviously do not think of that as being too much. They actually feel, very passionate about the level of detail of how they speak and how explicitly they express things, precision, exact, literal meaning. And so Germans are, in that sense, that's very good for science, by the way. They make excellent scientists because of that, because of how precise and how exact Germans are. But they're like that in speech as well. which is why, the idea of respect, the idea of titles and last names, reflects in all of that. So Germans are straightforward in some ways, like Americans. And so for some people, they appear to be very blunt, very direct, and say things exactly, because they are precise. That's the idea. They appear to be very direct. Some people could consider that disrespectful, but it's obviously not meant in a disrespectful way. They're just direct. They approach things the way they are. Where other cultures prefer a more, indirect approach in talking to each other. So go ahead.
Sir, I have a question about the German.
Sure.
You said German people, they are proud of their language.
Mm-hmm.
But I heard many German people, they can speak, they eagerly learn how to speak in English. And
Sure.
actually, they very fluent when they speak in English. So there is a reason they eagerly learn to English.
Well, most Europeans learn English for practical reasons. That doesn't mean they don't like their own language. They like their own language very much, and they insist on using it, by the way. But for business reasons, for reasons of connecting with other cultures in a greater world, most Germans do speak English. I mean, I have to say this. Okay, so I spent some time in Berlin. Okay, and my German is not that great. My German is very basic. I took German in high school. When I was like in 8th or 9th grade. I took German 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. So I had like 2 or 3 years of German, and it's not great. I understand the basic constructs, the grammar. My vocabulary is very poor, so I go and when I speak German, Germans laugh at me. When I try to speak German, which just tells you how bad it is. But I get around, and so I did have a hard time getting around Berlin, because you'd think in Berlin, in the capital, most people would speak English, but a lot of people did not speak English in Berlin at all. So I had to use my really bad German to get around a lot of times. And so that was surprising to me. But you're not outside, of the, fray there, Paul, when you say that Germans do know English, but so is true of French, and so is true of Italians, and so is true of Norwegians, and there's a lot of people in Europe that do study English, and it's becoming more and more an international language of the world. But Germans are very particular about their language. And it's a very old, very ancient language, obviously, that has a lot of culture into it. As many other nations, their languages are ancient, and there's a lot of history behind them. So there's no reason why people should lose them. But we do, in Europe, most people are multilingual. I mean, very rarely you'll find people who speak only one language. Okay. It's very normal to speak more than 2. Let's put it that way. A lot of times people speak their local language, wherever that language is, then they speak another language of their neighboring country, and sometimes they learn yet another language for business or whatever they're doing in life, if they're in some sort of a trade business or something like that. It's very, very normal to be multilingual. Where for Americans, that's strange. But for Germans and French and Italians and Swedish, it's normal to speak several languages. And English is usually one of them. Let's put it that way. English is usually one of the languages that people speak. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, let's go to interpreting. Interpreting is something that there's a couple of things I want you to know. I find this section helpful to a degree, but not 100% relevant, sort of say, to this particular class. So couple of things that I wanted to highlight. First of all, whenever we transmit from language to language, things don't correlate. You guys already know this, because languages simply do not have a way of expressing what other languages, say. And even if they do have equivalents, the equivalents are not exact. So there's always things lost in the process of transferring from one language to another. And that's what essentially interpreting and translating is. Now, I wanted to set it straight. Americans confuse this all the time. Foreigners do not tend to confuse it as much because they get to deal with this more. But I do bump into people who cannot tell me the difference between translating and interpreting. Can you tell me the difference between translating and interpreting?
I think translating is just like translate some document to another language document. Interpreting is verbally change the language.
Bingo, 100% right on, bullseye. See what I just did? I used several idioms. When I say bingo, unless you play bingo, which is bingo is an American game, you have no idea what I just said. And I said bullseye, and unless you understand what that means, which is a reference to a target practice, bullseye is the very center of the target. Okay, so bullseye. Why they call it bullseye, I have no idea. You shoot bulls, I guess. But that's what people say in America. So when I said that, what I mean is you hit the target 100%. Translating has to do with written words. Okay? Interpreting is an oral process. Okay? So an interpreter is a person who transmits speech to speech. Okay? And they do that in the oral environment. And a translator who translates writing to writing from one language to another. That's the major difference. Now, most people, again, who are not multilingual will not get this one right. People will use those terms interchangeably as if they're one and the same thing, but they're actually two very different things. And the process of translating, interpreting is very, very different, by the way, because when you translate, you have time. You sit down, you can look words up, right? You can go through the dictionary, you find the best word, you translate that sentence, and then you retranslate it, then you reshape it, then you smooth it out a little bit to make sure what's the better word. Well, maybe that word is good, but maybe that word is better. And you have a chance to think and revisit and edit and change things around. When you interpret, you don't have that chance. Because spoken word, and then you're expected to find an equivalent for what was being said that is appropriate. You don't have time to say, excuse me, I'm going to open the dictionary and look this up before I tell you what this means. You don't. And so for that reason, translating is way more precise and interpreting is more loose. Always more loose. There's always more room for improvement and for difference in interpreting. But translating is way more precise because a translator takes their time to make sure that they find the best, ways possible to convey the same idea in another language. Okay, so that's an important thing I just wanted you guys to know. There's different types of interpreting. Maybe you ran into this or not, but these are good terms to know. Consecutive, okay, and simultaneous. So I actually used to work, one of my first job, well, not my first job, but my second job maybe, but one of my first jobs was actually to be an interpreter. That is what I used to do. I worked for the Chamber of Commerce. I worked for Ministry of Tourism. I worked for all sorts of people. In America, I worked for the courthouses, for the Department of Justice, for all sorts of people actually doing translating and interpreting. Sometimes I would take documents, which I would translate, and they would later be notarized and become official records. And sometimes I would interpret, like in a courtroom, for example, during a case or in a hearing, a testimony, things like that. So, or at a medical appointment, something like that. It really depends. we used to get hired by different companies to do different things. That the needs that they had, were diverse, but that's what I used to do. So the difference between consecutive and simultaneous is basically speed. Consecutive is when you say a phrase and I have a little bit of a time, a little bit of a lag, then you pause, and then I say that phrase or a sentence. It could be a complete thought, it could be a sentence, it could be two sentences. But the idea is that you say it, then you stop, and you allow me an opportunity to translate what you said, and then when I'm done, you continue. Okay, that's called consecutive. A simultaneous interpretation is when you don't stop. You talk, and I talk over you. And it's very hard to do because I actually have to listen everything you say, and I have to speak at the same time as I'm listening. There's no pauses. So that's actually a very difficult thing to achieve. I've had to do simultaneous translation, simultaneous interpreting like this, and I only did it with a whole team of people switching. About every 30 to 40 minutes, we switched, because your brain becomes absolutely overloaded. You become mentally exhausted because you have to think so fast. You don't have any pauses. You just have to say everything the person says while they're saying it as you're listening to the next sentence. It's very difficult to do. If you've ever had to do that, it takes a lot of training actually to get to that level. So not every person who even knows languages well and fluently is able to do that. It takes a lot of work. But I used to do that ages ago, but that's what I used to do. So I guess maybe that's why my English is not so bad. So because I had so much practice. But that's the idea. So translating, interpreting. There are a lot of cultural considerations. Why? Because there are things that do not move from one language to the other. Some cultures are more direct, others are more indirect. There's some great examples that the textbook gives us about, for example, Mexican Spanish, that there is a term indicating agreement in varying degrees, okay? One says, I promise, or I commit myself. The other one says, I assure you, okay? Then it says, yeah, sure, I will do it. The other one says, maybe I will do it. And the other one is, perhaps I might do it. Now, all of that is agreement, okay? But there's different degrees of agreement. Now, how do you communicate that in English? I say good luck. Because the problem is, even if you translate it, even if you communicate it, even if you interpret it correctly and accurately and precisely, the person on the other end will still may misunderstand it, because they will take that information and they interpret it the way they particularly understand it. So this is the problem. The problem is some things simply do not translate. They do not interpret. There is loss of information. You can't express 5 different degrees of saying yes, in Spanish. I mean, how do you do that? It's just doesn't work. I can't possibly see how this can be done. Or another example they talk about here in Spanish, the concept of ahora, right? So I don't know if I'm pronouncing it even right. So talking about, I will do this within few minutes or several hours of time. Okay. But the most of the time it gets translated as now. Well, to American, now means right now, like this very second, instant. And there's a disconnect, an immediate disconnect. And so if an urgency, like an instant, needs to be, communicated, Spanish language has that, and they're able to add that on, sort of say, to the words to communicate that something is immediate, like ahorita, or Harita, Haritita. These are all ways of being able to take that ahora and make it faster. Let's put it that way. So again, languages, there's a huge problem with transferring meaning from language to language. And that's why translating and interpreting is never precise. Working with interpreters, that is the section that I find probably the least helpful, unless you're planning to be working with interpreters. These are really good advices, by the way. Having worked in that field, very good advices. But I don't know how they're useful for most people. For most people, they're not, truly practical. The chapter addresses the idea of interpreting and technology. And I don't know if you ever guys tried this technology that exists. Has anybody tried mechanical translation yet? You have? So Matthias, tell me how it works. Tell me, is it good or is it bad?
I think it's improved a little bit, but in the first time when I use it, the structure from the Portuguese grammatical rules is totally different than American and English structure. And sometimes we need to think like Americans and put in Portuguese the phrase, the sentence, with every word in
flipped around.
Yeah, and change the words place to have a good translation. But if you use just in the Portuguese grammatical rules, you have a total different translation.
So mechanical translation does not work for Portuguese very well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Anybody else tried this? You guys want to share? How did it work? Anybody else tried the mechanical translation in their language? You couldn't figure out how to say it in English or something like that, and you needed to translate from your native language. How did it work? I tried it, and so I noticed that, in most languages that I've tried, it's okay, but it's not perfect, and it's definitely imprecise, and there's still a lot of improvement that needs to happen. Because in the end, humans are humans, and the way that humans communicate is so unique and so unusual, and they have not been able to write a really good software that can mimic the way we communicate to the degree to which it would be accurate. And so it's hard. They're good, good things. I'll tell you what, one of the best things that I've tried that I like a lot, and it's called Google Lens. Okay, and that works really good on languages, by the way. When you see a sign in any language that you don't understand, you can get at least an idea what that sign says by using Google Lens. And all you need is your phone and a Google Lens app, and you point to it, and it will actually take those words and it will tell you what those words are. So, imagine, you're out there somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and you're looking for a restroom, and you do not know how to say restroom in that language. And you do not know which one is men's and which one is ladies, for example. You don't want to go with the wrong one, and they have no pictures, right? So what do? You use Google Lens or something like that, for words. Directional signs, such and such, this direction. Marketplace that way, garbage dump that way. You need to know the difference. You don't know those words, so especially if it's an alphabet of a language that you can't even read. So Google Lens helped me out a lot with signage in places where I don't know where things are. Anyway, that's it works good for at least give you an idea. But as far as language translation, we're still not there mechanically. The last section, that just a few minutes, guys, and we wrap it up. The last section of this chapter talks about developing a competence in a cultural setting. And that is just more of a reminder, more of a reaffirmation. You heard some of these things already, is to understand that be vigilant about how you use words and be mindful how you do that. There is a lot more than just the words of how people use language. And cultural uses of language is so diverse that you have to be very careful, very mindful, very attentive to learn how different people use language. And by knowing a little bit about their cultures and how they use language, you will gain a greater competency in understanding them. One of the best ways to do that is actually to learn foreign languages. If you speak more than one language, then you're already on the way of being much more open-minded about how other people's languages work and much more open-minded about how other people's cultures work. Because when you learn another culture's language, you are learning their culture, because language and culture are interconnected, okay? So learning a second, third, fourth language will give you a cultural inroad into whoever, so to say, owns that language, wherever that language comes from. It will give you a greater understanding. You know, learning English allows people to understand how Westerners think, essentially. The whole world is learning English, right? Because it's such an international language. And what it does, it allows people to enter into the conceptual world of a Westerner. You know, and specifically, you know, it all began in England, presumably, right? But it is largely a Western language, and Europeans, you know, get it a lot more than non-Europeans do, essentially. And so whichever language it may be, if you are learning that language, you are learning that culture. And when you learn a language, you get insights into that culture that only that language will be able to give you. And there's no other way for you to gain them. So being multilingual is a huge advantage, because not only you're able to speak other languages, but you are able to understand other cultures, because your mind starts working in different ways when you adapt to learning a different language. You expand your mind in areas where other people from your culture have never gone. Okay, and that's a huge advantage, being able to understand things in a different way, in a different perspective. This is why a lot of, you know, I teach a lot of students, you know, and we study the Bible together. And I always tell people, I said, you want to understand the Bible, you have to learn the language of the Bible. The reason why people don't understand the Bible is because they try to read the Bible in their own language, and that loses the meanings. It's different. It's translation, and whenever things are in translation, stuff always gets lost. And so the more people study the original languages, the more they start understanding what it is the Bible is trying to say, because each language is unique. Greek is different, Hebrew is different. So I do emphasize a lot for people to learn even the basics of language, of those biblical languages, and their study. And it opens up people's minds. I can't tell you how many students I had that have taken the journey. That's not easy, but when they did, they say, oh, I could see so much more now. I can understand so much more now. Even being able to, you know, read a little bit, I am so much further along in my understanding of what I'm reading. And so it changes people's minds. So you know, to make the point, sort of say, is learning languages expands your mind, and you become a better intercultural expert by learning those other languages, because you're entering into the world of how people think, how they form their sentences, what's important to them. And that is a huge advantage. So, so being mindful as you are able to go from language to language, you become mindful very easily. It's almost intuitive that people allow for other meanings behind words. because you understand that, because you know that, because you have experienced that by learning other languages, things like that. And then being respectful of somebody who does not speak a language as their first language. So second, if you're learning something and you're having a conversation with somebody and that is not your first language, you have to work a lot more in your head to understand it, because your native language is automatic. It's easy. But if it's not your native language, it's a second language, third language, fourth language, you're having to work a lot harder, because you have to transfer those concepts, those ideas, and you have to adapt them. So by learning other languages, you become a more respectful, more gracious conversational partner, because you understand what other people have to go through to understand you. If you are having an intercultural communication, here's the key. One of you is not speaking their native language, right? A lot of times, unless both of you are speaking language that's not native to each one of you, but one of you is not speaking. So if an American is talking to a Brazilian, so if they're speaking English, then one of them is at a disadvantage, right? Who's at a disadvantage? Well, of course, the Brazilian is at a disadvantage because they're speaking English. But if they're speaking Portuguese, then it's the American who's at a disadvantage. And you have to learn how to show, grace towards the person who is at the disadvantage in the conversation. And the reason you know how to do that is because you yourself have learned what it's like. You felt it, you know it, you've been there. And so speaking multiple languages makes you a much better conversational partner for sure. Especially in an intercultural setting. There are some conversational taboos that you guys need to know about. Different cultures are different, but there are many forbidden topics in various cultures. For Americans, very little is forbidden. They're very open with everything. But for many cultures, there are some things you simply do not say, especially when you meet the person for the first time. There's some topics that are off limits, like talking about religion or politics or things like that. Some things you just don't go into. They're reserved for best of friends, let's put it that way. When you speak and you are engaging in a cultural environment, watch the rate of your speech. Okay, especially if you are the person who is speaking your native language and the other person is not. You have to think of how fast you speak, because the other person is at a disadvantage. They need a little bit more time. And so some people speak very fast. And if you have been studying a language and hearing people just go off in that language that you've been studying really, really fast, it's hard to catch up sometimes. It takes your brain, a few more seconds to get there than their brain gets there. So watching your rate is just being respectful and mindful. How fast do you speak? Watch your vocabulary. Do not speak with words that you may think or suspect people will not understand. I have to catch myself all the time because I will use colloquialism. I will use idioms. And then I realize, nobody understands what I just said. So I have to watch myself all the time. And that's a skill that you just basically have to develop in intercultural communication. And something that the book authors say over here that's very true: humor does not translate. Most jokes will not translate, okay? They're cultural. So avoid translating jokes, okay? That will not work most of the time. And then be attentive to the verbal behavior, because this is one of the things that we have. Sometimes verbal behavior is used to confirm what you're saying with words. So if what you're saying with words is not clear, then what you're saying with your body, with your face, with your gestures clarifies it, okay? So watch it and use it as well. Use nonverbal language to convey meanings, and that helps people. Use check-in devices is another great technique. That means periodically when you speak to people, verify that they actually understand what you said. It could be very demeaning to a culture that is, let's say, more reserved or more indirect, to say, do you understand? You know, because that would be like disrespectful. Most people would say, oh, do you think I'm dumb or something? Why do you have to ask me a question, do you understand? So instead of saying, do you understand, say, am I being clear? So put the burden of clarity on yourself rather than the burden of understanding on the other person. Because if they say, no, I don't understand, that makes them sound dumb, right? Which is not true, because maybe you're not clear. So put the burden on yourself. Am I being clear? Does it make sense? Am I making sense? Am I being clear? So you would hear me say that all the time, probably. I mean, how many times you've heard me say, am I being clear? Does that make sense? You know, and all I'm trying to ask, basically, I'm trying to confirm that you're with me, that you're tracking, because if it doesn't, then I want to know. Because if I say that, you know, and I get the feedback that I'm not being clear, then it's an opportunity for me to clarify. But if nobody answers, then I have no idea. Okay. So it's a very helpful tool that we can use called checking devices, by saying, am I being clear? Does this make sense? You know, but there's also a right way to use that tool, by the way. So intercultural communication and language, there's lots of obstacles, a lot of problems, so to say, but we can overcome some of them by basically becoming aware and becoming a better speakers and becoming more mindful of how, once you understand how languages work, you become more mindful of how you use them. Okay, that's pretty much what this chapter is about. So that gets us to the end. All right, so if you guys have any questions, please let me know.